I'm Didi Kuo, the Associate Director of Research at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. Our event today is co-sponsored with the Stanford Graduate School of Business, the Corporations and Society Initiative, and the Leadership Now project. Today we're asking what is wrong with US democracy and what should reform look like? And we'll start by hearing from three panelists who will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes each about what they see as the main threats to American democracy. Well, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Anat Admati, the G.C. Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business and Director of the Corporations and Society Initiative. Then we have Daniella Ballou-Aares, the CEO and co-founder of the Leadership Now project, which is a membership organization of business and thought leaders committed to fixing American democracy. And finally, Alex Kaplan, the Vice President of Policy and Campaigns at Represent Us, an organization that brings together diverse coalitions for political reform at the state level. So thank you so much. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Anat.
All right, thank you, Didi, and thanks to all the other organizations for putting this together and all of you for coming here. Democracy is not gonna work without participation, without civic participation. And so I'm gonna try to give very briefly, from my perspective, with a little bit of my own how I even got to be here as a finance professor, perspective on it. How does a finance professor from GSB get to be a democracy advocate, you know, and academic advisor to Leadership Now, and director of Corporation Society Initiative? Well, my entry into democracy issues is a financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. We probably have a larger representative of ages, so some of you may remember that, and not as children. And it kind of shook me up to the point that it was about the financial sector that I was teaching for years was such a wonderful system that's helping the economy in all these ways. And what just happened there? And why did it need all these bailouts? And what just happened? So when I started looking, I realized that something was wrong with the rules and the regulations of this system. They were kind of a mess. And then they said, oh, we're going to fix it. We're going to have Dodd-Frank, we're going to have this, we're going to have that. And when I looked at that, I didn't like what they were doing. And it wasn't that it was too much or too little, it was just poorly designed. And it was also inadequate, but also too complicated in many places, some unnecessary things, just a bunch of things that public didn't understand. And then, and some of their reasoning for it, and this is really what shocked me, what gave me the pause about democracy, is that a lot of the reasoning that was used around the reform was just wrong, and it was contradicting absolute basic stuff that we teach in business schools. And I was shocked and amazed that, you know, people were using words that they didn't seem to quite understand, or they were using them wrong, or people just didn't really have any idea what some of this stuff was that was being discussed, even though they were involved in setting rules. So it was a pretty traumatic experience to see that and then to try to fix it, which I did for the try part. I didn't fix it. And that's sort of where I realized democracy is not working that well. You know, there were other forces. Let's say I met the politics face to face. I met people who wouldn't engage. I met lobbying. I met all kinds of things I never imagined. I interacted with media, all kinds of things. And my conclusion was that democracy is not working when it's not based on, you know, the right, whatever, call it science, the little science that we have on some things. We do have some understanding of them, even in my dismal science of finance. Anyway, and so I am coming at it from a governance perspective. Governance is very much about, you know, democratic governance, corporate governance, the governance of all institutions, meaning that whoever makes a decision on behalf of other people with impact on other people has the right information, the right expertise, the right incentives, and accountability. So those are kind of ingredients of institutions that tend to be trustworthy. And in order for democracy to work, for corporate governance to work, for capitalism to work, we need institutions that are trustworthy. And democracy is about institutional trustworthiness and about a system that we're all part of. It's a part of a sort of a social contract that we have. Do we trust the system? Do we trust the institutions? Are these institutions somehow dysfunctional? What makes them dysfunctional? One problem in democracy is certainly the way capitalism has undermined democracy as practiced. And what I call this version of capitalism, there are all kinds of versions people talk about. I call it financialized capitalism because I know it's all about finance and society has become very financialized. So financialized capitalism is all about, maximizing stock price, and it's all about, profit metrics from accounting or something. It's those kinds of metrics of success. And the politics becomes influenced by that because in the US, we have a lot of money in politics in general, not just from corporations, but also from wealthy individuals. And money in politics can distort things if there's not enough forces to balance that, and if the public can be deceived about issues. And so in preparing for this panel, and then I'll try to stop, I didn't put my my timer, but I'll stop in a second. On Sunday, when I was thinking about this panel, I was reading the New York Times on the weekend. I still get the print pages and I like to flip through them. So that's unusual, but the treat of the weekend. And in the art section of the New York Times was a piece called What I Learned from the Movies About Democracy. Oh, here's the word democracy and the movies. Okay, let's see what they say. So there were 7 movies there, and he discussed some other movies in between. And one of them was about finance, about money. And the movie they sort of said was The Wolf of Wall Street. Now, I've never watched this movie. I heard about that movie. And, but I thought, okay, if I can squeeze it in, unfortunately, it's like 3 hours and I do not necessarily recommend it, but I did make it through. It was difficult. It was late at night. I needed a glass of wine last night, but I did finish it. And it wasn't as useful as I thought. But what the main point there was that the success of this guy, of course, the government ends up winning. If you watched it, it presents the government in an okay fashion, but the guy basically was a sweet talking salesman, and it was all about salesmanship. So the bottom line is we need information. And these days to say that there are false claims and falsehoods is no longer that interesting. We live in a world of people believing all kinds of things. So how do we get trustworthy institutions? We do need people to start believing in governments. I think the government attitudes of the government is the problem have ruined democracy. The government is all of us, and we need to start thinking as citizens all the time. As we do our pursuits of other things, maintain that picture of the collective. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Admati. Now to Daniella.
Hi, thanks Didi, thanks Anat, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm Daniella Ballou-Aares, the CEO of the Leadership Now project. We were founded in 2017 as a membership organization of business and thought leaders committing to fixing democracy in this country. And I want to share a little bit of the context of the organization and then how we've been thinking about this problem and addressing it. So in 2017, I came together with a group at that time I was a fellow Harvard Business School alumni. We were coming out of the election. I'd spent my career building a global social impact company called Dahlberg, and then served in the Obama administration. I joined with others from a whole range of backgrounds to really ask the question, what was going on in our democracy? Why was there the polarization we were seeing? Why did we come out of this election with so much fear about the future? And we felt that we needed to be smarter in the approach than just kind of come out of that with supporting a candidate or taking a kind of purely political approach. So what we've really done over the last several years since 2017 in starting and founding this organization that now has members across the country is try to start with the question first, what's going on in our democracy? What does the data tell us about the state of our democracy? And then how do we engage, whether it's by supporting good organizations that are addressing the most significant issues, or ourselves as business leaders taking a stand when challenges to our democracy arise. And I'll share a little bit of what we've learned in that process and what we're seeing now in terms of the state of our system. So, and I'm going to share a couple of slides, but in the big picture, I think what was been clear as we've worked with academics and we've really started to build this national organization is that, for our democracy to sustain, we all have to be well-informed. We have to be engaged and actually watching and participating in the system. And then we also have to do the hard work of shifting the incentives of the system so that it is effective. And that, unfortunately, is not something that's accomplished in 2 years. It's not something that's accomplished in one political cycle. It is a generational almost, or a decade-long project that you have to undertake in order to really shift from a system where few people are paying attention, where our institutions are weak, to one that not only functions and is legitimate in its functioning at a basic level, but is actually effective and able to respond to the challenges of our modern world. And what I think many of us in business who are working at the forefront of whether it's technology or finance or other areas see how government has not been able to keep up with those industries in an effective way. And the question, of course, is who do we blame for that in some ways? And as much as we want to blame someone else, and there are lots of culprits in all of this, I think in the end, we have to ask ourselves, what's our role and what can we do with all of our networks and influence and expertise to be part of that solution? So that's what we've endeavored over the last several years. And I'll share with you a couple of things that have come out of that, those efforts. So first on the data, so a couple of big picture insights. I think the headline and kind of why we're here today is a recognition that our democracy is in trouble. And when you look at the data, that's not something that only started now or in 2016 even. Basically, faith in government has been on the decline for the last 20 years, and we are at all-time lows. We're at 20%, it's even a bit lower, in really Americans trusting in government. And when we look, a third of Americans really question the outcomes of the election. They don't believe it was legitimate. And also in 2020, we saw the US downgraded by the Economist Intelligence Unit from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. And we ranked 25th, which is below most OECD countries. So we have this context. And of course, this picture kind of reminds us that we did have this moment in January 6th where the kind of very fundamental of the system were questioned. And so, for all of us, how do we start addressing that? And two things that I'll share in terms of where I think the most significant opportunities and leverage points are right now. And first is really to start with an understanding of what's happening state by state in the state of our democracy. And so I'll share with you one other picture of that. So one thing we started to endeavor to do last year is really take a state-by-state view on how is our democracy functioning, because this is very varied by state. Of course, there's some things that are national. Disinformation is a national issue. But when you take one level deeper and you look at what we've kind of key elements of the function of the system, underlying elements, we look at voting, we look at electoral systems and the impact of gerrymandering, campaign finance, and representation as the key areas. I won't take you through all the details of this scorecard, but what we find is when you look state by state, you can see based on third-party objective metrics that look at things like how long do you have to wait at a poll, the cost of voting for index, for instance, which is out of University of Northern Illinois. There are quantitative ways to understand what good looks like and not so good looks like in the functioning of democracy. And it's not a purely red state, blue state issue. New York, for instance, is a C in the functioning of democracy. California has some weaknesses as well, though it's better off on some of these. I believe it's a B. With that foundation, we've now been able to really mobilize business leaders in states like Texas within our membership to say, we want to see strong performance on democracy. We want to see strong performance on voting rights. And we know what good looks like because Oregon is an A, and you actually know what strong performance looks like. So I share all that data just as the backdrop to the question then of what does action look like? And I just wanted to share kind of 3 key things that we've seen as effective action by business leaders. So last year, we were part of one of the first organizations to come out in a public way with business leaders ranging from Reid Hoffman to Seth Klarman to our members across the country, saying we really have to make sure for the good of business that this is a legitimate election, that all votes are counted, and that we take this seriously. And really since then have been working in lockstep with a wide range of industry associations, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce or Business Roundtable, others, or many companies have come out on those issues, really reinforcing that this was a legitimate election. And now we're seeing that continue as the challenge of what do companies do as voting rights laws are being introduced state by state that might move on that scorecard, move a state that's already poorly performing to want to even a worse place in terms of performance on voting access and voting rights. And here I think is where we're at, really an inflection point. We last month hosted a CEO meeting where over 60 CEOs came together. We did that together with Yale to really ask the question, what are CEOs going to do on voting rights? What will that look like? How do we carry that forward? And I think our overall learning is, we're seeing companies come together, whether it's Georgia or recently in Texas, but there's still many, I think, in the business community who are looking to figure out what's the path to be effective on engaging on these issues. And I think that's where there's really an opportunity to continue to work really at a state level, and you'll hear about that from Alex next, as well as in your company as an individual to make clear what do you want to see from your democracy and what good looks like. So I'll flash one last thing on the screen, which is this week, I had a piece in Fast Company that speaks about what can business leaders do in order to support a strong democracy as we're seeing voting laws state by state. And our recommendations was, one, to support evidence-based policy at the state level, to re-examine your political giving and really understand where political resources are going in a company, and are they inadvertently supporting voting laws or organizations or political leaders that are undermining the access to the vote. And then looking at federal legislation, there are federal bills like HR 1 and HR 4 that are being considered that could address some of those challenges. So with that, I will put in the chat a couple of links to our organization, as well as to some of those resources that I shared, and really just pleased to have everyone here today, because the first step, I think, for all of us is learning together and problem solving about where we go as a country next.
Thank you so much, Daniella. All right, over to you, Alex.
Great, thank you, Didi. Everyone, it's pleased to speak with you tonight. My name is Alex Kaplan from Philadelphia, although I spent 6 wonderful years in the Bay. I work with Represent Us as our Vice President of Policy and Campaigns. Represent Us is a national nonpartisan organization. We work in the states to build support and then to build winning campaigns for public interest democracy reform. And we do so by bringing conservatives, progressives, and independents together to pass reform that we know voters do want at high 80 and 90% percentages. So I like this prompt. What are the 2 most pressing issues? And I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack. I like to take a short and a long view every time. And so in that vein, I have 2 dates for you. The first is August 8th, 2021. And that's 83 days from now. And the second is November 5th, 2024, which is some 1,300 or so days from now. So let's start with the first. I think it's easy to say that the most pressing issue today is the fact that the controlling factions of one of our major American political parties, the party I was raised around, has effectively rejected democracy and embraced voter suppression and the manipulation of truth as its winning path forward. But we all know that, so I don't actually think that's the most pressing issue, at least for this room. The pressing issue that I see is that there's a clear solution on the table, Daniella just mentioned it. It's called For the People Act, HR 1 and S1. And it does three major things outright. It outright prohibits voter suppression, stop all the bills we just saw. It sets reasonable national standards for voting access and objective election administration. And it ends federal gerrymandering. And the problem is that it's passed the House. It has 49 co-sponsors in the Senate. Its fate lies entirely in the hands of one person with that final vote, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. It needs to pass in the next 83 days, and not enough people are talking about it. When I wake up every morning, when I think about the last many years and what I need to do today and what we need to do going forward, that's the most pressing issue to me, is to get people talking and working on this. 83 days until August 8th, and that's the date that Congress packs up for August recess. They go home for a month. In that time, the Census Bureau is going to drop its first set of data that's going to be used for redistricting and used for gerrymandering. And all hell is going to break loose with gerrymandering. We have 83 days to pass this bill. And for reference, because this year is speeding by, 83 days ago was February 24th. We are very, very close to passing the most monumental and most essential democracy reform protection that incentivizes basic democracy. And business leaders really do need to put their weight behind this bill. And in so many ways, especially given the gap in who's talking about this right now, business leaders' voices are some of the most effective, as we have seen in some of the states, to move this forward. Because if we don't pass the For the People Act right now, the ascendant anti-democratic wing of the GOP is going to be rewarded. I'm going to talk about rewards a lot. It's going to be rewarded for passing their slew of recent voter suppression bills in Georgia, Iowa, Texas, Florida, Arizona. They're going to be rewarded in being given a green light to pass more of those. They're going to be given a green light to gerrymander more effectively than ever before. And the Supreme Court has made clear that they're not going to stand in the way of this either. They're also going to be rewarded by reaping predictable results of those surgically targeted voter suppression bills. And those results are winning elections and further entrenching anti-democracy ideology. But also rewarded because politics, as you know, is all about incentives. And so the prompt for tonight's session was, what should democracy and reform look like? Here's my view. In a representative democracy, we should see the objective translation of voter preferences, all voter preferences, into aggregate and reflective representation. And in that way, our candidates should be incentivized to campaign for broad support across their district, their entire state, because we want an electoral system that rewards it. And then when they turn into representatives, they should be incentivized to legislate and govern in the broad public interest because the electoral system rewards it. So it takes me to date number 2, and I know I need to keep going faster, November 5th, 2024, next big election day. That's the longer term most pressing issue, is that the structures of our electoral system under the Constitution are pretty outdated and not adequately designed to withstand what I see as a triple threat. This triple threat, the pressures of modern hyper-politicization, the polarization of the loudest part of the electorate, and information manipulation. Those three things, it's going to be a major challenge to fix any one of those three. But there is opportunity when we look at the problem in a different way, and that's what we do in the state level, because we can adopt reforms that help ensure that these problems don't translate into inaccurate representation. Otherwise put, we can better manage these problems. A good example is that in 2018, Represent Us and a number of other nonpartisan allies supported a bipartisan group of Alaskans in building a ballot measure campaign to pass nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting general elections. And if you remember, during 2020, when Senator Lisa Murkowski, a moderate Republican, crossed President Trump, he said in many forums that he would make it a personal mission of his to primary Senator Murkowski for crossing him when she runs again in 2022. The campaign was already underway, but when the ballot measure campaign led by a bipartisan group of Alaskans won in November of 2020, now what's going to happen because of this new reforms, first state that has ever done this, Senator Lisa Murkowski won't be able to be primaried from the far right because all candidates run in one nonpartisan primary, and the 4 candidates who are the top vote getters proceed to the general election, where ranked choice voting, when you put your 1, 2, and 3 candidates in order of preference, helps select the best consensus candidate for Alaska. And so I want to close with this. We have the opportunity to pass this type of model policy and other interesting, powerful, and constitutional policies in many more states in 2022, in time for that 2024 election, to affect the US House, the US Senate, and use a form of it for presidential candidates as well. If we don't, I think we'll almost certainly see a lot more of the successful primary knockouts. Think about Senator Ben Sass in Nebraska. But most importantly, we're going to continue incentivizing anti-democracy. And I think the business community can really focus on setting a standard of what we expect in a democracy and help pass these reforms and incentivize it. When I was thinking back to President Biden's recent address to Congress, the thing that stood out to me the most was when he spoke about China. And he said of President Xi, there's a quote, "He's deadly earnest about becoming the most significant consequential nation in the world. He and others, autocrats, think that democracy can't compete in the 21st century with autocracies because it takes too long to get consensus." So I think what I'm trying to say here is the next 3 years, and most specifically the next 83 days, are a truly momentous test for our democracy. In the medium term, we have these powerful, creative, constitutional forms like nonpartisan primaries that are showing great promise. But also today we have necessary, truly immediate reforms in front of us. We have to pass the For the People Act to reinforce our basic commitment to democracy. Thank you for listening. Appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you to our three panelists for laying out this discussion so well. You know, there's a lot of polarization, partisan polarization, and this has trickled down into our discussion about sort of fundamental democratic rights. So the first question to our panelists, and we can take them in order, Anat, Daniella, and then Alex, is why do you think that the basic issue of voting rights, and whether we call it suppression or we call it election fraud, how has it become such a partisan issue, and how can we use rhetoric or talk about these political issues in a way that transcends partisan gain?
Well, unfortunately, we have a situation in which people view everything as a sort of zero sum. I win, you win, and if my way of winning is to change the voting rules in particular ways, then I'm going to do that. And so again, it's a sort of lack of civic-minded thinking about what it is, the bigger picture in the longer term. And so, you have the game of narratives and stories about, election fraud with no proof, and then just cynical efforts. I do support very strongly HR 1, and I'm glad Alex brought it up. I do think it is urgent to discuss it. So I endorse what was said there.
Daniella and Alex, any thoughts on partisanship and the discussion of voting rights?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we're at this place, right, where it's so hard to find voices that are not bucketed into somewhere in the political spectrum. And that is the opportunity that business has, and why you're seeing CEOs and others being called upon. Because when you look at things like the Edelman Trust Barometer, it says that, in a very low trust society, business and CEOs are seen relatively higher as a source that's not seen as purely partisan. It's sitting in one place or another. So I think, the question is, what do you do with that as a leader? I think in the business community, do you kind of not say anything to preserve being seen as not partisan or otherwise, or are you part of really setting a line in the sand around what are the basics that should not be partisan? And if they're being made partisan, that's not acceptable, essentially, right? The basics that we know are core to democracy, that everyone is able to participate, that the rules of the game are fair, that we recognize elections, et cetera. I think there's a whole segment of Republicans that would welcome that support from the business community of standing for that. I don't think it's a purely a partisan position. So yeah, I think our overall emphasis has been, we need to define the principles and policies that are good for democracy based on evidence, and stand for those. And if there's a partisan game happening underneath, that doesn't mean we won't be willing to stand up on those issues.
I will briefly add, I think part of the problem is that because so much inflammatory language around voting is put forward by people who know what they're doing with information manipulation and feedback algorithms in Facebook, Twitter, and the like, Two interesting things we've seen in polling that we've conducted in some of our partners nationally, as well as in West Virginia, Arizona, and key states for federal reform right now, is that the language around freedom to vote really resonates well across the spectrum. So do voting rights, actually, far more than you would think if you listen to the Twitterverse. People also really support across the spectrum at the levels of somewhere around 72% of Republicans, 80% of independents, and above 90% of Democrats, setting basic national standards for voter trust, security, and election administration. People understandably feel, and sometimes not understandably feel, that things didn't go well last year. And that certainly was true. The way forward is to set national standards that everyone can abide by and feel like they have trust in, and continue to build public education about that trust, while talking about the fact that freedom to vote is inherently American. I'll close by saying the thing that I love most about my job, focused on cross-spectrum support, is that when you use the correct words and not in a manipulation way, just basic American-focused standards on democracy, we all agree, almost everyone still does, that we want a democracy where everyone has the freedom to vote, which national standards we can trust, and a democracy that works for all people.
Okay, great. All right, we're going to start asking some questions that are coming in from the audience. First, this idea of public service, is there a way to stress the importance of growing and developing public servants the way that we look at the importance of startup CEOs, for example? And anyone can take it, and from the panelists.
I'll say something about that. I'm a huge fan, and I feel like I carry the legacy of an old dean of Stanford Business School, R.J. Miller, who spoke a lot about, he wanted to have a public management program. He would only move to be the dean of Stanford Business School, which he was from 1969 to 1979, if he was promised that Stanford Business School will educate some public service people, some civic leaders, because he came from also his executive position at Ford, and he lived through the Detroit riot, and he saw government, and he knew we need good people for government. So it is the fact that, you know, the private sector is able to overwhelm government in expertise and now in resources as well, because it's work to deplete the government of resources, expertise, incentives to do the right things. We need to strengthen that, as we need to keep the government accountable as well. So there's a lot of rebuilding to do of civil service in this country, dignified civil service and efficient government, but a competent government.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the importance of the related points of the need to attract more talent into government and politics, and to kind of rebuild respect for it. Because as long as we see government as something, and leaders in government who are ineffective or who are, you know, are not trustworthy, et cetera, then our expectations are low. We have this kind of, and this loop, right, where we're not going to get the government we want if we don't have the leaders we want, et cetera. So I do think we have an opportunity in that the way that you ultimately get good leaders as well into government is to have enough people paying attention and engaged, and you're seeing that generationally, a lot more engagement. And I think our thesis has always been, you know, there's a whole set of business leaders who've had careers, or care about these issues, and should be civically engaged. And some of them might even run for office or engage otherwise. But the most important thing is that we're building a broader cadre of people who are willing to be active in the system in one way or another.
Right, exactly. Okay, so there is a question that is specific to HR1, and a sort of a debate in the chat about whether or not it allows non-citizens to vote. And whether there would be citizenship requirements under some of the different state laws that are being passed. So maybe Alex, or if anyone knows the specifics of HR1, could address that.
Yeah, certainly. HR1 does not change the citizenship requirement for voting. You have to be a citizen to vote. There are pathways to citizenship. That is a talking point we continue to hear, and it is an inflammatory one that does take root. I don't have much to say beyond that. I'm happy to go into the specifics in the section of where this goes. HR1 does have provisions to ensure that everyone who is a citizen can vote and has voting access, but it certainly does not change that.
Okay, so there's Oh, sorry, Daniela, did you want to jump in? No, okay. So there's also questions, even though we have a whole second panel next week on what the business community can do in some of these debates about voting rights and political reform, but there are some questions already coming in now about how business can get more involved in advocating for reform, and specifically on, traditional business alignments have potentially been between high-level business organizations and the Republican Party. Whereas today, as Alex mentioned, the Republican Party is fractured in a very visible way, especially with the events of last week that occurred in Congress and the ouster of Liz Cheney in the House from her leadership position of the GOP. So what do these typical sort of like factional alignments, how are they playing out now? And what can business leaders do to maybe align in different ways or to shed this reputation of being more allied with the Republican Party?
I can share a couple of points there. We've looked at, we did a polling and analysis of business people perspectives on democracy, and also looked at political affiliation and others from a large data set from LinkedIn a couple of years ago. And I think what you see as, in terms of party affiliation, for instance, that particularly as you get to business leaders under 45, it's closer to overall mix of the country, whereas business leaders would have skewed more Republican historically. There might be a bit of a skew, but there's more independence, a bit more independence actually in business than the overall population. But you see that overall, that sense that business is exclusively, leans Republican, et cetera, is more of an artifact than fully reflective of where business is today. So I think, with a business community that's fairly kind of, bipartisan or I do think there's kind of some of that shift is starting to happen. So the Chamber of Commerce, for instance, that for a long time was only endorsing Republican candidates, now included in their list Democratic candidates. But I do think the more fundamental question is, as a business community, what are you standing for, right? So if business, historically, industry associations, which are the main way, industry associations and individual corporate kind of lobbyists and PACs and others are the main way that business is influencing government. Industry associations are typically focused on a fairly narrow agenda related to that industry's tax and regulatory kind of priorities, and not focused on how do we actually get a healthy system that can govern well. And the consequences of that are problematic, because if you just have lots of associations all seeking narrow interests and no one's focused on the health of the system, you kind of get to where you are now. So, we think there's a real opportunity, both in some cases for existing industry groups to come out and be strong on saying there's basics we need for our democracy to function that's not unprecedented for business to do, and then also for building new coalitions. And that's part of what we've done, is start to build that kind of new coalition and voice within the business community that takes a proactive stance.
Great, thanks, Daniella. So the final question before we go to breakout rooms is about broader democratic backsliding beyond just voting rights. There's a question here about the courts, for example, or the civil service have also been, either undermined or also sort of polarized in the past few years. What can and should, these discussions, how should they be integrated into broader discussions about improving democracy or reforming democracy in the United States? Anat?
I'd like to talk a few minutes about that. So I want to recommend to everybody, I'll try to put it in the chat, a new book by somebody I admire greatly and is, I consider my mentor now, is a judge in New York called Judge Jed Rakoff. And he wrote a book called Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free, and Other Paradoxes of Our Broken Legal System. And this is sort of pretty, he came to visit the class I teach in the GSB, and a student asked him, what do you do when the justice system doesn't work? Now, he said, I write a book to try to advocate, which has really resonated with me. But anyway, what he's saying is geared partly at the public not understanding some of the problems in the justice system. The devil is in the details, and I don't have time to explain now, but he does explain. And most importantly, he says that judges, especially at the federal level, but in general, have abdicated their own responsibility to hold power to account, kind of step aside and are not speaking up enough. So he's challenging his own tribe to speak up more. So the bottom line here, in everything that we've discussed before we go to the breakout room, is it's up to all of us. I mean, everybody has something that they can contribute to this project. It's a sort of a gap where everybody assumes it's working and it's not. And everybody's taking a narrow view of what they're doing and what they need to do and why they're doing things. And we do need more holistic view and more of us caring about the system.
So I really enjoyed the opportunity to moderate this great discussion today. Thank you so much to the team at the GSB that organized this, Allegria and Kathleen. Thank you to Michael Gallagher for organizing all of you alum. Thank you to all of you for your time, and to Anat, Admati, Daniella, and Alex Kaplan. Thank you all. So please have a great evening, and we'll see you again next week and in further conversations like this.